Hey, a lot of suspense there. Good evening. I am Sarah Truell-Roberts, the Faculty Director of the Program for Public Discourse and a Bowman and Gordon Gray Term Professor of Political Science. I would like to welcome you to tonight's Abbey Speaker Series event, Journalism and Democracy. The Abbey Speaker Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abbey Speaker Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a broad range of perspectives. As always, thank you to the generosity of the Abbey family for their generous support. We would like to thank our co-sponsors as well this evening, the Polis Center for Politics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and the UNC General Alumni Association. Tonight's event is the culmination of our year-long exploration of the relationship between democracy and public discourse. I look forward to hearing from our panelists about how changes in the media industry, such as the decline of local newspapers, might impact American democracy. I also expect a lively conversation about the meaning of objectivity in journalism and how to ensure that citizens receive accurate information about public life. All of our panelists are accomplished journalists who have decades of experience covering news at a wide variety of media outlets. McKay Coppins is a journalist and author currently working as a staff writer at The Atlantic, covering journalism, religion, and Republican politics. Recently, he published an expose detailing the purchase and closure of local newspapers by financial firms and the negative impact on communities they serve. Coppins has also recently published a book about the transformation of the Republican Party following the 2012 election. John Hood is president of the John William Pope Foundation, which advocates for individual freedom, personal responsibility, and strong communities here in North Carolina. A proud Tar Heel with a long history of service to North Carolina, Hood holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from UNC and currently serves on the board of WUNC-FM and the foundation board of UNC's Hussman School of Journalism. He has written a syndicated column on politics and public policy for North Carolina newspapers for more than 30 years, and has also served as the president of the John Locke Foundation for nearly 2 decades. Neferi Vinansky is a freelance writer who spent 17 years working for local newspapers. After graduating from Hampton University, Vinansky worked variously, as a copy editor, news editor, and columnist for publications in southeastern North Carolina and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, including the Star News and the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. Her article about the importance of diversity in the newsroom, written after the murder of George Floyd, has been part of the national conversation about media coverage of police. Our moderator, Molly Worthen, is a freelance journalist and an associate professor of history here at UNC. Her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. Worthen is a contributing opinion writer herself for the New York Times and has written about religion and politics for the New Yorker, Slate, the American Prospect, Foreign Policy, and other publications. Thank you to all of our panelists for participating in what is sure to be a timely and thoughtful discussion. Thanks also to our program assistants, Hunter Matthews and Jonathan Nichols, and our event coordinator, Nora Hannigan, whose hard work has made this speaker series the success that it has been this year and beyond. I'll now turn it over to Molly, our moderator for this evening.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. For those of you joining us on Zoom, I appreciate you braving the rain and the general cloud of malaise that is hanging over our campus after last night. And we're going to do our best to cheer ourselves up by talking about the decline of civilization, right? It's gonna be awesome. It's gonna be rousing. I'm supposed to remind you of a couple of things. One is that this conversation will be recorded and will be posted on PPD's, the Program for Public Discourse's YouTube channel. At the end of the formal part of our discussion, which will run for about 40 minutes, we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll start with a couple of questions from our Zoom audience. And folks on Zoom, please use the question function on Zoom to post your questions, and one of our staff will curate those. And then we have a microphone here, a standing mic. Those of you who are with us live can line up and tell us your question that way. All right. I want to start with maybe some reflections on recent history and just ask, as you scan over in your minds, the past 5 years or so of history, either in the media in particular or the various cataclysmic events that we've passed through, is there anything that stands out to you that really made you concerned in a new way about the state of American media and its relationship to democracy?
I'll start. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I was kind of just having a conversation about it yesterday, but about, around the country, the recent banning of books. And the reason that I've been thinking about that as it pertains to journalism is that, in my experience in local newsrooms, like, a big, well, not big part, but part of what our reporters did were go to school board meetings, and they would find out about these things and they would, write a story about it. And, we would all make fun of the fact that they're the only people in these meetings. And the fact is that people have their lives to live, and that's totally fine. And, but what used to happen when, people would come to school board meetings and propose banning books is that a reporter would write a story about it, and those parents who couldn't make it to the meeting would read that and say, wow, that's terrible. And they would do something about it. And now we're hearing about it like after it's done. And that's, to me, I look at that and I think, were there reporters in the room? So that's kind of one thing that I am thinking about a lot lately that kind of makes me nervous.
So it's a symptom not just of kind of the culture war landscape, but it particularly is a symptom of the decline of coverage of local news.
I do think so, because I don't know that, and people can say what they will about political polling and how political it is, national polling, I should say, and how political that is. But there isn't a lot to indicate that there are people out there looking for books to be banned. Most of us are beneficiaries of books not being banned. So nobody, we're very fortunate to have access to whatever we want. So I do believe that, I think that sort of is a failing of not having that reporting, and not so much people saying, no one, I don't believe that people are clamoring for that.
Well, I'd keep the focus on local journalism for a second. It'd be very easy if we talked about the last 5 years. We could immediately zoom into our favorite national political story, and this was outrageous. No, that was outrageous, and perhaps we'll get into all of that. But for me, the area of greatest concern really is state and local journalism. Whatever we think about national journalism, there's still a lot of it, arguably more than anyone could ever consume or should. But when you get into the state and local level, a couple of vignettes from a couple of years ago really stick in my mind. As you said, I've been writing this twice a week syndicated column for newspapers in North Carolina since 1986. And periodically I will go and visit newsrooms and talk to the editors and find out, if there's a new editor, I definitely want to know them. And it's part of my customer service, so to speak. And my latest trip a couple of years ago to a certain part of the state, one of the largest dailies in the state, went in to meet with, at that time, a fellow who was an old editor friend of mine. And the building was largely deserted, as if there had been some kind of natural disaster. Off in the corner was the entire news department. This newspaper used to have dozens of people in the newsroom. Most of the building is vacant. Went in there, they looked frankly kind of shell-shocked, and there was a lot of furious, for the people who were left, probably having 3 or 4 different beats. They were kind of stressed out. And just the day after, I got a phone call from another community, and there was somebody who, I used to be on television, was someone who'd seen me on television and called me to ask me a question. I said, what do you, question about what? She said, well, I went to the city council meeting last night. I was the only person there who was not on the city council or a staff member. And aren't you supposed to take multiple bids when you, she didn't know, but she sort of thought maybe something was wrong. But that gets to your point of even when local journalism is done by, and when I was first reporting in a newspaper in Eastern North Carolina, I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't really know exactly what I was doing, but at least I was in the room and I was asking questions and I was writing notes and I was challenging things. And I think that is the greatest danger to the practice of democracy, or one of the greatest dangers right now, is simply a lack of raw material, of information about what is happening in our communities, because the business structure of newspapering, as we all know, has been kicked out from under it for a variety of actually mostly positive reasons. Technology is great, the internet's great, but it's ruined the revenue base for much of what was public service journalism at the local level. And we're going to have to replace it with something. And there are efforts to do that in some areas, but we better get on the ball, because this is a sort of a ticking time bomb that is waiting to go off, or maybe has already gone off.
So I'm gonna cheat and give you two moments that stand out in my mind from the past year that made me concerned. So one of them was last summer, I traveled to Chicago while working on this big story that was mentioned in the beginning about hedge funds that were buying up local newspapers and gutting them for profit. I was focused on one hedge fund in particular named Alden Global Capital that has kind of made it its business model to buy hundreds of newspapers and then dramatically cut costs by slashing staff, outsourcing copy editing and print design to the Philippines, closing down newsrooms, all these other things, consolidating papers. And they had recently purchased, when I traveled to Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, which is one of the most iconic local newspapers in the country, right? It's been around forever. It, endorsed Abraham Lincoln, to give you an idea of how long it's been around. 20 years ago, it had 700 journalists working in its newsroom. And I met with the head of the newsroom union, who is this young guy, City Hall reporter. And he said, "Oh, have you seen the Tribune Tower, the iconic, Chicago Tribune building in downtown Chicago?" And I said, "No." He said, "Let's go look at it." So we went up. We were in this bar, and we went up and we saw this beautiful neo-Gothic building that had been built about 100 years earlier. I said, "So you guys aren't here anymore, right?" And he said, "No, let me show you our newsroom." And we had to take a cab across town to get to their newsroom. And we walked down this long cinder block hall and took a couple of elevators. And we got to their newsroom, which was about the size of a Chipotle, right above their printing press. And there are now on staff, I think it fluctuates between 50 and 100 journalists, down from 700 20 years ago. I'd been hearing for years about the struggle of local news, the decline of local newspapers, but for a local newspaper as large and influential as the Chicago Tribune to be reduced to that was really striking to me. So then fast forward a couple months, I ended up on the phone with the head of Alden Capital, the president of this hedge fund that had bought the Chicago Tribune and many other newspapers. And I won't go into the whole conversation, but the thing that most struck me was that when I presented him with complaints from community leaders and readers and people who had seen their newspapers, their local newspapers, dismantled by this hedge fund, he didn't even attempt to make a defense of what they were doing. He basically said, "Yeah, look, like we're trying to make money here. We're following a business model. This is our investment strategy." He didn't care about the downstream effects on the communities that these newspapers served. He didn't care about the people in these communities. These were numbers on a spreadsheet for him. And for me, that was really clarifying, since we all started out talking about local journalism, that the hedge funds like Alden Capital didn't, they're not responsible for the decline of local news. There have been a lot of market forces and forces in our society that have led newspapers to get to this point. But we're now at a point where local newspapers throughout the country are so weakened and so undesirable in terms of as assets that really, aggressive, ruthless investors can come in and buy them and gut them, and nobody's noticing. And the effects on community, there's a huge body of literature on this. The effects on communities when a local newspaper is gutted are just ruinous. Voter participation declines, misinformation spreads, conspiracy theories spread. There's even some evidence to suggest that local, to speak to John's point earlier, that local city budgets balloon when a local newspaper shuts down because there's no, watchdog keeping track of where this money is going. And so, that for me, realizing that the people who are doing this now, who are taking advantage of these weekend newsrooms, are, not really thinking at all about the civic effects of what they're doing, really concerned me.
Okay, one of the most tragic parts of that magazine piece is this noble effort that the reporters that you interviewed make in many of the cases to bring a kind of belated but still quite powerful attention to the situation and to try to find a good-hearted buyer or rally some community concern about this, and they fail. And one does get the impression that even when readers like us hear about this happening, our reaction is often pretty apathetic. I'm wondering, as you diagnose the shrinking and collapse of some of these local media outlets, how do you balance in explaining it, the technology, the problem in the adaptation of older business models to the new media landscape, which I think is frequently the scapegoat, against maybe changes that are harder to pinpoint in American identity, in the way we think of ourselves as readers, the kinds of stories and the kinds of communities we link ourselves to and care about. And of course, I can see that there would be sort of a reciprocal, kind of dangerous spiral as both things change. But I wonder, how do you parse out those kind of technical, business, and cultural causes?
Well, the familiar story on newspapers is so much of the revenue came from classified advertising. It came from car ads and house ads and want ads. And if you can get a house, get a car, get a job on the internet a lot more efficiently, that's what you're going to do. And there's nothing the newspapers could have done about it. And I think there is a great deal of truth to that. I think that's probably the largest part of the story is simply the revenue. It's not even reader behavior or anything. It's revenue model. But you're right. It's a more complex story than that, and there's a cyclical effect. One of the things that really struck me, we were in fact talking about it before the program began, is the extent to which people used to sort of, in effect, hire local intermediaries to decide what they ought to read today or what they ought to watch if they were, for example, consuming local television news at 6 o'clock or whatever. Somebody who was there, wasn't actually far away typically, somebody who worked in the community, had a sense, might have been flawed, might have been biased, but there was a serious effort to decide what you might see or hear or watch that day. And we do still have intermediaries. It's not as if we all just go on the internet without any guideposts, without any algorithm guiding our choices, without any choice on our part of which email to read, which Twitter accounts to follow. We still do this, but it's much more nationalized. We no longer have as much of a sense that I ought to read the following 6 or 8 articles because I live in Chicago, because I live in Charlotte, because I live in a particular community or even in a state, because it is so much of a national oriented audience. And I think that what that means in part is that the package that people used to purchase, whether it was literally a newspaper or watching TV or even listening to a local radio station, you had a package of things that you really wanted to hear, but also things that were part of the package that you just sort of ran across serendipitously because it was in the paper. But once you saw it, you didn't really want to read what happened in the Charlotte City Council last night because it doesn't really matter to you. But once it's there and you read it and now you know something you didn't know, a lot of that serendipity happens, but now it's clickbait ads and it's things that are national. And so the state and local focused items just don't get as much readership. Well, then you don't do them because it doesn't generate as many clicks. It doesn't generate as much traffic. So there is a kind of a downward spiral where reader response combined with how people are consuming media and the revenue trends leads you to focus more on not just the national or international, which of course very important, but not the only thing people need to know, but also the most sensational version of those things, the things that tends to be in your version of the internet because the algorithms have steered you that way because you read the New Republic or National Review or The Nation, or you watch MSNBC or Fox, and the algorithms know that. And so they curate an experience for you that is quite different than the kind of experience previous generations have in ways that have some advantages, but lots of disadvantages, particularly when it comes to the thing we were all mentioning at the beginning, which is public knowledge of and therefore public ability to monitor state and local government.
Can I just say something on that? Because I think it's interesting, like this nationalization of news media is so important because I do think, you know, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? Like are reader habits migrating toward national news and therefore, you know, damaging the profitability of local newspapers? Or is it the local newspapers are declining and there's less local news and people are only getting national? I don't know, you know, there's probably some of both, but the result is that, like you said, these local stories don't get any attention until they suddenly become viral national stories, and then they're wildly distorted, right? Because they're run through the partisan media cycle, and you know, they end up on Fox News or MSNBC, right? Where now you've gone from not knowing anything about these local school board officials because you just haven't been following it, to now these local school board officials are national villains or national heroes, depending on what the story is. And that's so toxic, both to the local communities where these stories end up playing out, but it's also just toxic to our national media landscape, right? To you know, go back to something that Barry was saying, think about the debate we've been having over the past year about these banned books, right? And critical race theory and what's being taught in schools. This is going to be probably one of the main wedge issues of the midterm elections this year. It's going to be playing out throughout the country. I remember when I was in Chicago, I was talking to one of the reporters I spent a lot of time talking to was the education reporter in Chicago. And she was saying, you know, I'm doing my best to cover Chicago schools, but I'm one reporter doing this, and there used to be 5 or 6 of us, right? And what's often happening is that if there's a story I can't get to, it gets covered by somebody who has no experience on the beat, very little sourcing, doesn't have all the context, doesn't know the 14 developments that happened over the past 2 years that led to this moment, and is instead thinking, what's the best way for me to write this story to get it on cable news, right? And that's what's happening. And that has an effect on how we are interpreting these debates, how we're participating in these debates. The fact that we just don't, that we pay so little attention to the stories until they end up in the national media, and whether that's, you know, in cable news for probably older people who tend to watch cable news, or it's popping up on your social media feeds in, again, probably fairly clickbaity, distorted form. Either way, it's not giving you the actual information you need to make a reasoned judgment or participate in a nuanced conversation. It's purely, you know, catharsis and entertainment and designed to make you angry.
Yeah, I think what's kind of interesting is in talking about, you know, what is feeding what. You know, when I was I spent a big chunk of my career in Pittsburgh, and you know, in local newspapers, and listening to those readers, and you know, for all the guff that we would get for anything they didn't like, if we didn't run the school menu, whatever, you know, they were obviously reading the paper. You know, and so I know that we are trending more towards a nationalization thing, but I think it's more by force, like that is what's available, as opposed to, you know, what readers necessarily might want. I do think there's an appetite out there for local news, and I think that, not feeding it is really what's leading to everything. Because just from what I would experience, I had a column that would come out for the larger Pittsburgh area, and it would come out the same day as 3 of my local newspapers. And every time my phone rang, I could like at least 70% of the time, it was about what was in those local papers and not necessarily in my column, But that just shows that there's an appetite out there. And I'm not sure how we get back to providing enough quality, because I think that's another piece of it. You can't really ask people, you can, but it's hard. It's a hard sell to ask someone to buy a local newspaper when the resources are clearly not there, where there's not good stories, where the stories are, there's the same story on page 2 and page 9. It's clear that that the quality is not there. And you wouldn't do that with anything else that you buy. You wouldn't say, well, it's not a quality product, so let me throw something at it. You really, it needs to be a quality product to convince people to pay for it and to consume it. Otherwise, the trust is lost as well,
I will take this opportunity to plug one exception. In our own state of North Carolina, there's a relatively new online magazine called The Assembly that is busy recruiting really experienced reporters from around the state and covering cultural, political, economic, healthcare, education news for subscribers. That's their model, for-profit subscribers. But it is a sort of one bright spot that I see in what is otherwise a pretty bleak landscape. I want to ask about objectivity. I'm interested especially in maybe the relationship between the decline of local news and the current state of the debate over objectivity. Here, I thought I should probably define my terms a little bit, and please edit and quarrel with this definition as you see fit. Here's how a historian named Michael Schudson defines objectivity. The belief in objectivity is a faith in facts, in quotes, a distrust of values, also in quotes, and a commitment to their segregation. So keeping facts and values separate, that's the idea. So take it or leave it as you will. Thinking about your experience in different kinds of newsrooms, did the conversation about objectivity look different covering local news as compared to a national story? Is the accountability different? The way you have those conversations with your editors different?
Well, this is well-trod ground. I remember being on campus here at UNC in the mid-'80s, early classes on news writing and reporting. And even then there was a debate about, is objectivity really possible? What do we really mean by objectivity? And I got kind of impatient with it then, and I'm still a bit impatient with it now. I think objectivity in a sense is impossible, but it's not the right word for what journalistic detachment is about. It's really about accuracy, it's about fairness, and it's about balance in a broadly defined sense. In other words, if you're covering a story and you just talk to people who think one way about a given bill and you don't talk to people who think alternatively about a given bill, then one could say you're not being objective, but a word that better defines it is that you're not being accurate because you're not describing the full contours of debate about the bill. There's a reason why it's controversy. And you're not being fair. You're not giving people an opportunity to make their case in an issue that is a public dispute. When I was young and working as a newspaper reporter in Eastern North Carolina, it was my job to write the facts, what, who, where, how, why, et cetera. It wasn't my job to, of course, express my opinions, but most of my career was spent either as what I still do today, which is writing a newspaper column where I do express my opinions, but also report facts, or at magazines that have explicit political or philosophical leanings that are stipulated to ahead of time. So I worked at Reason Magazine, which is a libertarian magazine. I still write for them. I write a lot for National Review. And early in my career, I spent a year at the New Republic. And the reason I bring that up is the New Republic in the 80s was a rather different animal because it was more of an eclectic mix. Michael Kinsley was down the hall for me, but also Fred Barnes, who I worked for, was the other way down the hall, conservative, center left. Mickey Kaus, who at that time was a progressive, but later changed. Rick Hertzberg, who was a progressive. So there's all these different people, and they argued and they discussed and they fought and they slapped each other on the back and they argued and they discussed some more and then they had a joke. And between them, they often came to something like a version of what is happening in a given political story that reflected some different viewpoints and came closer to the truth than if any just one of them had been writing just from their perspective. So my view about this is, I love philosophical debates, so we can talk about objectivity if you like, but I think what people usually mean by that is if I'm going to be given the news from a source that purports to give me just the news, then it ought to be fair, it ought to be accurate. And that means having different points of view. And it also means probably that the newsroom itself and the editorial, you probably need to have a mixture of people in the newsroom. It needs to be truly diverse in all sorts of ways, because that makes it more likely that somebody on the team will see something that nobody else saw. So that's what I think of it as, even when you're working for the Nation or the New or National Review, which has a ideological or philosophical bent to it. Even then, in order for you to be doing your job as an opinion journalist, you still have to be accurate and you still have to be fair, even though you might choose a topic you know your readers are going to be more interested in because of your shared philosophical leanings, or even if you're going to express your opinion about it somewhere in the story, those journalistic standards still apply. And frankly, that's what I was taught in my editorial writing class here at Chapel Hill.
Is that still happening though?
I think it's still being taught here at Chapel Hill,
I'm sure it's still taught here. I'm talking about, I think a lot of opinion writing now does not really strive for that balance. And that probably
you have to give some, in order to, I think, make a good and fair and persuasive argument, you have to be willing to give a good faith description of what you're arguing against.
Yeah.
If it's just all skewed and nonsense, it's clearly just, it is indistinguishable from political campaigning and slimeball behavior. And it's not journalism.
Right.
It's something else.
That's true.
Oh, go ahead.
I appreciate this connection you're making between the individuals you have in the newsroom, representation and method, because often the two are separated and they're not separate. But I'm struck by, there has been some controversy on our campus as a document came out of our journalism school here questioning the relationship between diversity of viewpoints and the mission of coverage of the news, and this idea of some sort of commitment to objectivity or fairness or whatever language you might use, suggesting that, in fact, among people who are teaching and being trained to be members of the media today, there's a sense that there ought to be guardrails, that there's a real limit on how much viewpoint diversity you should have in a newsroom. I wonder what you all think of that relationship between that different kinds of diversity and fairness, accuracy.
To me, it feels as if we probably aren't even close to guardrails yet, because, I don't think diversity is very strong in newsrooms to begin with. I don't think we're approaching a point where it's like, wow, there's just too much of everything. The newsroom that I grew up in and came up in was, very white, very male. And when I came in, it was that way. When I left, it was that way. And so, I think we're only starting to get to the point of, having a bit of diversity, and perhaps that bit is making people uncomfortable because it's not what they're used to. And, but I think that just really goes to challenging your own borders and your own limits. Are you willing to read a story that gives you the full picture of a, police interaction, or, is that making you uncomfortable? And if it's making you uncomfortable, are you questioning yourself, or are you questioning the publication? Is it the publication's fault that you're uncomfortable?
Could you say more, Neferi, about your experience covering that issue in particular, and the relationship between accuracy and different perspectives on the story and your interaction with editors?
Right, sure. So I was a columnist, and I was writing a fair amount especially after the death of Trayvon Martin, was writing a lot about, race and policing. And I had gotten a tip from a lawyer who said, I have this video of this police interaction. There was a chase with a driver who had a warrant out for him, and the police chose to kind of, pursue a chase. And, they ended up in a very busy part of downtown Pittsburgh on a Saturday night. And, there was a large car crash, police opened fire, and he let me know about this. And I, wrote about it. He gave me access to the driver's mom was in the car, and she was also shot. And I interviewed her. I interviewed a cab driver who was kind of, he just was stuck there in the middle of crashed cars and bullets flying. And, he obviously, from the video, he thought he was going to die. He was praying. He thought he was going to die. And, I think you can certainly, and I'm pretty sure that when that happened, the Trib ran a very standard story about an arrest that happened in south side of Pittsburgh. But I had the opportunity to kind of expand that and paint a fuller picture and say, okay, this is what the police are saying what happened. There's this video, and there are these people who were, just kind of stuck there. And this is a whole, this is a different perspective on that story. And, at the time I had an editor for my column, and he really championed it and went to the managing editor of the paper and said, this is a really good story, and I think it should go on the cover of the paper. And then that editor went on vacation. And when that happened, the editor that he suggested it go to, the managing editor, kind of called me into his office, and he was like, I see what you're saying with this story, but, cops have a hard, police are, it's a stressful job. I know cops, they're doing their best. So what I'm gonna do is kind of just trim this story a little bit, and now I'm gonna turn it into one of your columns. And he just completely just took everything out of it. There was, photos and everything, all of that was gone. And he turned it into just, I just hate even thinking about it. But, I think that is an illustration of what happens when you don't have diversity in the newsroom. When you have one person in a room saying, what, even if it's true, who cares what they think? Or who cares about their experience? They're criminals, they're bad people, whatever. I mean, that really shouldn't, our job should be to tell a full story. If you want to call that objectivity, that our job should be to tell the whole thing and not worry about what people have to say about it, because no one's ever going to like everything you do anyway, except your parents maybe. But, we just have to, so I feel like diversity in that situation would have been, him saying, I don't know, this story rubs me the wrong way and I don't know why. And him taking it to his editor, to two of the other Metro editors, and they're saying, there's a video, just having a conversation with a group of people, as opposed to being in, just being surrounded by people who look like yourself and making those decisions based on your own feelings. I think in that case, we did a real, injustice, because, those people trusted me with their story, and my goal was to tell it and to not say, here's their story and here's what you need to think about it, because I was writing it not as a columnist, I was writing it as a news writer. And so I was just, this is what happened, and I think that should really be our goal, is this is what happened. This isn't what you need to think of. This, opinion is certainly a different animal, of course. But if you're a news writer trying to cover a beat, this is what happened. And then you decide what you think about it. We should give them enough information to do that.
So to me, listening to both of you talk, you're both basically making, I maybe I'm presuming too much here, but the case for diversity of all kinds in newsrooms is being made by both of you in the sense that, like that story you just told, a huge problem was that the newsroom was way too white and way too male and way too I'm imagining too socioeconomically similar, right? And this is a problem with a lot of newsrooms, right? That like the version of the news that comes out is basically you weigh the worldviews of everybody in the newsroom, and then what seems like balanced and objective is the middle of that, right? And if your newsroom is overwhelmingly white, male, and college educated, then what's going to seem balanced and objective is going to be very different than if you have a newsroom that's much more racially diverse, much more economically diverse, and much more ideologically diverse. And to go back to something you asked about at the beginning, or a few minutes ago, Molly, that this idea that there should be more guardrails in newsrooms or in media organizations, that not every viewpoint should be expressed. I think almost everyone agrees with that to some extent, right? That everybody in this room could identify an opinion that they don't believe should be, aired in a publication, right? A case for child abuse, for example. Nobody wants that to be published, right?
The moon landing was fake.
But aren't you kind of
Earth is
setting up
flat.
straw men?
Well, but that's my point. So the actual debate is about where those boundaries should be, and that's where it gets really contentious, right? That, I work at a magazine that, the founding manifesto of The Atlantic was that the magazine would be of no party or clique. And the editor-in-chief today strives to have a wide variety of political opinions represented at the magazine. We have libertarians and conservatives and liberals and progressives and leftists, and there are writers that argue with each other in the pages of The Atlantic, and they think that's good. But there are still on the margins boundaries that are difficult to figure out, right? And this is where I think your definition that you read about of objectivity, I think, is a really good one. Separating facts from values is a really interesting concept. But the reality is that journalism itself has a set of values, right? Journalism, at least in theory, should be, in favor of, freedom. It should be in favor. It should be against, government authoritarianism and against censorship in various forms. And this is where the inherent values of journalism will come into conflict with popular ideas in the discourse right now. So, for example, are national publications obliged to publish arguments in favor of dramatically censoring the press? That's not all that unpopular an idea if you attend the kind of Republican rallies I've covered over the past several years, right? That you can very easily find people who argue that the government should issue licenses to news organizations, and that that it should be much easier to sue journalists and all that. If that's a popular idea, are news organizations obliged to air that idea? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. There's all kinds of questions about the treatment of immigrants and refugees that seem to the average person in a newsroom inhumane, but that are very popular and mainstream in one part of the political coalition, in one political coalition in this country. Do we have to air arguments defending those practices? Again, that's where these debates become much trickier. And I don't presume to know all the answers. I tend to err on the side of, I guess, let me put it this way. When I was studying journalism in college, and when I was falling in love with this job and this career, I was really into the idea of the marketplace of ideas, right? I believe that if you air bad ideas, they will be defeated eventually. That an enlightened society needs all ideas to be kind of aired out, and we debate them, and the good ideas will triumph over the bad ideas. But I think for that theory to work, you need some semblance of a common set of facts that everybody is operating from. You need a shared reality that everybody is operating from to have these debates. And the way that our media ecosystem has developed over the past decade that I've been in journalism, that the idea of a shared reality is collapsing. And I get nervous about airing really toxic, poisonous, harmful ideas when even, you know, every documented fact produced by diligent journalists will be dismissed by huge portions of the country because it doesn't align with the way they see the world. And that's where I think, again, this debate becomes really difficult.
John, do you think that those boundaries on what's considered an idea worth reporting on or allowing advocacy of are drawn too narrowly? I mean, why were you moved to found some of the news organizations that you founded?
Because the guardrails were defined too narrowly. Yes, that's pretty much it. McKay, you're right. I mean, everybody agrees that there have to be guardrails. You know, that you can't just treat an opinion, the moon is made of green cheese, because we've got to be fair and balanced. And so we're going to have that expressed along with, you know, the real facts about the moon, which is that, of course, it's made of blue cheese. But the point here is that when you define the when you narrow those guardrails too much, I believe, and I think that, again, this is not a new debate, this idea of, do you police, but then what about creating a forbidden fruit phenomenon where people will now, they're suppressing the truth. The truth must be something else. This is not a new thing. This was a debate 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but the internet has obviously changed it, and political polarization have changed it in ways that make it a much more proximate question. Think about the story, and I know it's been beaten to death at this point, but the Hunter Biden laptop, all right? How significant was the Hunter Biden laptop to people's decisions for president? Could debate that, whether it was really that important. The problem is that the attempts to suppress the story through the algorithms and the media outlets that refused to, you know, all of that did is it destroyed their credibility later. And in the meantime, it made it seem much more likely to people I know on the right, well, that it must be true. If they're taking all this effort to hide this piece of information, that proves that it must be true. I think I would stipulate it would have been much better to just let that story fly and let people make their own decisions instead of rigging the system to suppress, you know, the ability to find it on the internet. I think that was a big mistake. Now, that having been said, are there stories where you shouldn't give them credence? Of course there are stories that you shouldn't give them credence, and McKay is right that it's a difficult balance. I think that you should be leaning on the side of air an opinion that is widely believed by some people, that have some semblance of fact base to it. If it has no semblance of fact base, you don't report it because you're a journalist. But even if you disagree with an opinion about immigration policy or anything else, I recall when my former TNR colleague, James Bennett, was fired for running an op-ed in the New York Times about a subject. In my opinion, it was his job to run op-eds and viewpoints that expressed, from a US senator, they expressed an opinion that maybe lots of people didn't agree with. I'm not sure I agreed with it, but I thought that was a cautionary tale about how we've taken the concept of guardrails that, again, stipulated, everybody agrees with, and we're narrowing them too much, and we're also reinforcing the idea, I can't trust them. They're not going to tell me the facts. They're not going to report the news. There was, in fact, a laptop. It had some stuff in it. It was very embarrassing to Hunter Biden and maybe involving his dad. And I need to know that maybe because I'm going to vote for president shortly, and they won't let me know that. I can't trust them ever again. So if we're worried about building trust, having some common set of facts that people are willing to read multiple points of view type of media, if we're going to go to that world, which I think I'm in favor of, and I hope everybody else is, we're going to have to be comfortable with politicians and ideas and viewpoints being given some coverage that make our teeth grind, because that's what it's supposed to feel like.
I'm glad you mentioned that Tom Cotton op-ed. I did want to mention that in connection, Neferi, to what you were saying about the value of, and I guess, John, you brought this up too, a broad face-to-face conversation among editors of different perspectives. I heard through the New York Times grapevine that part of the trouble there was the situation of COVID and the fact that no one was actually physically in the New York Times newsroom when any of that happened. They weren't face-to-face. They weren't having informal conversations. Hey, what do you think about this? Or what are our reporters over there going to think about that? What's the situation in this part of the country where you're based? Conversations that in ordinary times would have happened and might have changed the handling of that affair in one way or another. I want to push on this question of the values of journalism as a profession. It seems to me that whether you're emphasizing diversity or a conscious consideration of the guardrails on ideas, fairness, you're partly talking about a mature attitude of a journalist who's been socialized into an institution and respects an institution, respects a sort of broader profession, and has an identity linked to their newspaper or their magazine. And I've heard it said, I heard a really interesting interview by the conservative Yuval Levin, who made the point that young journalists today have no such loyalties. And when they start at a newsroom, they are primarily interested in building their brand. They see that magazine or newspaper as their platform, from which they will go on to greater things. And this really changes their incentive. This makes them much more inclined to write from a narrower ideological perspective because that will sell nationally. And I wondered what you think of that perspective, of this sort of generational shift.
Well, Yuval is very much interested in institutions. People haven't read his books about institutions and how they should be formative, and instead they are performative. The idea is that you go into an institution, and maybe whether it is Girl Scouting or a certain sports team or a university or a newsroom that you've joined and you really want to be part of this team. The idea is that it should be forming your character in some way that's painful, but you do it because it's going to make you more effective, more wise, whatever, in the long run. And that what's happening now is that institutions, people just pick and choose them based on how good they feel. They give you immediate gratification. They allow you to perform. His argument even applies to politicians, that they run for certain offices and all they're trying to do is perform, build their list, perform, so they can get up to the next level so they can eventually get out of politics, which doesn't pay very much money, and get on MSNBC or Fox, which is their real goal. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. However, just like we were talking, you gave the example of the Assembly, which is an example of a startup that is filling some of the niches in the local and state news. And there are many others. The Charlotte Ledger, I would call to your attention. A friend of mine, Tony Macias, started this several years ago. A lot of Charlotte Observer and Broadcast and other people from Charlotte have started a new enterprise that's very effective at covering business news in a rapidly growing city. So there are counterexamples of people who want to build institutions and work at institutions because they want the institution to be meaningful. They want the institution to be successful. They want the institution to have a certain reputation that people will take seriously. So there are young people that I meet and employ and work with who feel that way. But we all know there are many others who see their first or second or third job as a platform from which they perform, and it's real about building their brand. And in fact, to some extent, even their managers are encouraging them to build their brand. This isn't even something where they do it and the management is upset. No, the management kind of wants to employ social media stars, and you're a social media star, right? So
I don't identify primarily as a social media star. You can follow me at McKay Coppins on Twitter.
See?
No, but I mean, the pressure that you're describing, you don't even need, at this point, you don't even need managers to encourage you. I mean, if you go into a journalism career, not everybody, but a lot of people who end up in journalism are thinking about their followers and their audience, and if they're thinking about their careers, they're realizing that the more followers I have on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, the more people I have on my newsletter email list, the better off I'll be, the more marketable I'll be. It's also the case that this is a contracting industry. There's a kind of dog eat dog quality to the competition, and people want to they're thinking about themselves. But there is no question that the pressure to cater to a certain audience is very intense. And I can't speak to past eras of journalism. I'm old by the standards of the people in this room, probably, but I started in 2010 my journalism career out of college, and even in I remember in 2010, Twitter was primarily a fun thing that you would use to kind of make inside jokes with your fellow reporter friends, and now it's almost a qualification to have any kind of reporting job, right? You need to be on Twitter. You need to be out there cultivating your reputation, cultivating sources, sharing your stories, getting more readers, all of that. We could have a whole other hour-and-a-half conversation about how that has changed our industry, and I think probably for the worst, as somebody who has spent the past 12, 13 years on Twitter. But I don't want to end on such a cynical note as to say that the majority of young people going into journalism now are thinking about their brands. I think that that's a pressure, but I still think that a lot of people who go into journalism or are thinking about going into journalism, they might not articulate the values of the industry quite the same way as the past generation, but I actually believe that we have a lot more in common between generations of journalists than we have that divides us. I think that actually people want to hold the powerful to account. They want to tell stories of people that are not otherwise being told. They have idealistic notions about the civic role that journalism can perform, and I think that should be encouraged instead of relentlessly focusing on the generational differences and dismissing those who want to come into the field now. If anyone here wants to go into journalism, I encourage you, and come talk to us after, and we'll give you advice.
We should go to Q&A. Let's start with a couple of questions from Zoom, and I ask you to please make your way to the microphone if you have some questions for our panel.
All right. Well, I think partly because of the rain, we and I am going to start with two questions from Zoom. First of all, to what extent do you see university student newspapers meeting the demand for local news? Is it growing? Can university newspapers do that? And the second one, do you think the socioeconomic factor regarding the employment of newsrooms is a function of newsrooms moving away from a trade sensibility towards a more elitist attitude? I get the impression that most newspapers tend to reference obscure academic concepts that the public does not relate to. So essentially, is the newsroom full of elites, and is that a problem? How is that impacting our news?
Depends on the newsroom. Maybe a national newsroom. I don't think local newsrooms are full of elites. I don't get that sense, but yeah, I don't know. I from a national standpoint, I wouldn't have that perspective, but I don't think that. I think local newsrooms are. I don't think that's the bar. That's the thing that's keeping local newspaper reporters perhaps from connecting with readers. I think it's a lack of resources more than anything on that level, just because it's, knowing that I'm talking to a bunch of future journalists, I don't want to discourage you, but you're not getting paid a ton when you start out. So,
or possibly ever.
But we're not supposed to say that.
But in fairness, you never did get paid very much.
That's
I'm
true.
just telling you, yeah, it's awful, but the pay out of journalism school in 1970s was bad. In the 1980s, that's just not, it's not the field you went into, at least at first, to make a lot of money. I wanted to say something quick about the first question, because I think it's really important for us not to wallow in gloom too much. I think there are solutions to filling the local and state news gaps. I think that universities and student media of all kinds is part of that story. I think that to some extent, and you referenced the fact that I've created a media outlet here in North Carolina called Carolina Journal, which covers state and local news in North Carolina, but has a conservative editorial viewpoint to it. And there's a progressive counterpart called Policy Watch, and both sets of reporters cover some of the same stories. You can get a pretty good read on things if you read both stories. So I'm in favor of some, not so much partisan, but certainly ideologically oriented organizations can sometimes raise money and fill some gaps. I also think that public media, I'm on the board of UNC Radio here, and there are lots of other public media solutions. I think there are nonprofit solutions. I think, in fact, some local news is a sort of a classic public good in an economic sense, where it was sort of hitchhiking on the actual business model, which was to sell cars, sell houses, sell want ads, or sell jobs, et cetera. It was hitchhiking on that. Now that that's been decided, that bundle's been unraveled, I think some of it is going to inevitably be funded by philanthropy, by small dollar donations, by creative revenue streams like events. I think all of those things are happening in some of the local startups that I'm aware of or have been involved in. They will continue to happen. And so I think there are solutions. They're probably not commerce driven for the most part. They're probably some combination of educational institutions, philanthropy that is philosophically oriented, progressives and conservatives and others who are investing in journalism. I'm in favor of more investment in journalism, and non-ideological investment in public media and other kinds of nonprofit projects like we're seeing in a number of communities. And I think we will and should see more of that.
Yeah.
So I was sharing such cogent perspectives. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about media trust. For about 50 years now, Gallup, the polling organization, has asked American people, do you trust the media? And in the 70s, in the days of the Watergate and Vietnam War, it was 72%. They did the same, they asked the same question last year, and it was 36%, which means 1/3 of the people only trust the media. That was a little better than 2016, when it was its lowest at 32%. And then what we call a Trump bump, it went to 40%, and then it has come down. So that's, I think, in my humble opinion, a big problem for journalists, where their stories and their product is not trusted. What would be your ideas to restore trust in the media? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've hit on a really important point, and we probably haven't. I mean, maybe we haven't spent enough time in this conversation talking about how much of the problems of the journalism industry and the media are self-inflicted, right? We in this industry have for decades been making mistakes and alienating readers and refusing to build newsrooms that look like the communities we're supposed to serve in ways that have gradually eroded trust in the media. I also, as a primarily political reporter, should note that, you know, it's also true that the leader of, you know, the Republican Party spent 5 years campaigning on the idea that the media were the enemies of the people, that journalists were enemies of the people. That is naturally going to have an effect on those poll numbers. The one caveat I would add to those poll numbers is that it's a little like the polling question, do you approve of Congress, right? And overwhelmingly, I think for decades, the approval rating for Congress as an entity has been very low. But then when you ask people, do you approve of your congressman or congresswoman, it's usually substantially higher, right? The media as an entity has a very low approval rating. People do not trust the media because they tend to define it as the worst parts of the media, the parts of the media they dislike the most. But everybody has people in the media or publications that they like. And I think that, you know, how to restore the trust, I think there's a lot that could happen. I have increasingly been convinced that it has to begin with rebuilding local news, because again, the more people define the media and journalism as the stuff that's being produced in New York City and then bleeding into their social media feeds, the harder it's going to be for people to trust journalists, right? But if journalism that they encounter is being produced by people in their communities who share their experiences, who have kids that go to their schools, they're going to have a much higher likelihood of trusting media. I'm sure that there's a lot of other answers to this question, but that I think is an important part of it.
I think resources, in that local part, I think that's a big part of it. I just, there's a mistake aspect and not owning up to, when you do make an error in a story, that does happen. But also when you are used to, as we discussed before, when you're used to showing up somewhere or knowing that something is happening in your community and you don't see a reporter, that also is like, well, when you guys only show up when something terrible happens, which is getting true because there's not resources out there to say, okay, you're always going to this place, you'll always be there, you'll always have your ears to the ground. So I do feel like resources is a big piece of that on the local level as well.
You guys were talking, I was kind of getting the idea that you were separating like state, local, and like national news. And so I think an example was like government corruption and like at a local level. And you're talking about how like when it gets to like a national level, it kind of gets like distorted and you don't get the same idea. So like what separates local, state, and national news? Like how do you get that distinction of like what should stay local and what should go national?
Yeah, the way I would put it is that I don't have strong opinions about what stories should become national stories. I think it's fine for local stories to go national. I just want the bulk of the reporting on those local stories to be done by local reporters who actually know what's going on, as opposed to people like me who work for magazines in Washington, D.C. and parachute into them. I mean, let me just give you an example. Early in my career, I've always worked for national publications, and that's another thing that I actually feel kind of insecure about. By the time I got out of college, the path that had traditionally been there for aspiring journalists, which was you work at your local paper and then you work at a slightly larger local paper and you work your way up until you end your career at a national publication. That path had almost disappeared. So I went straight into being an intern at Newsweek magazine, then became a reporter at Newsweek magazine. Then I worked at BuzzFeed News. Then I worked at The Atlantic for the last 5 or 6 years. And early on in my career, when I would get sent to write about something that was happening somewhere in the country, covering a congressional race in Utah or California or Arizona, I would go there and there would be, still a handful of local reporters who would be like, oh, this guy is parachuting in from New York, and kind of roll their eyes at me. And I kind of took it because I felt like that was, part of the thing. And I would defer to their expertise and I would ask their opinions about, who should I talk to? Who should I not talk to? How should I approach the story? Now, when I cover those stories, there very often aren't any reporters covering the stuff that I'm covering. Like I come into, San Diego to write about some issue that's happening there, and there's very little local coverage of that issue. And there are not the kind of veteran reporters who can show me around, and I'm kind of flying blind. And I don't know that I wouldn't say that means I shouldn't write about the stories. I'm glad somebody's writing about this stuff. But it would be much better, and I'm saying this as a national reporter, if those stories were first being covered by experienced local reporters because they just know their way around better. And it would be better if the base of the coverage was happening on the ground in the community from reporters who live in that community, as opposed to people like me who parachute in from the coasts, if that makes sense.
Let me just do a different take on this just briefly. This is essentially an economy of scale problem. As I said earlier, we can debate, we have debated a little bit, coverage of national affairs. There are lots of outlets and there are lots of people covering it in print and audio and video and so forth. And that's better than not having, even if it's messy and people get it wrong, but at least there's lots of people doing it because of course there is a large potential audience. If McKay does a great story, and 20,000 people read it, it doesn't change anything for 200,000 people read it. And they're more likely to get to the 200,000 if it's about Trump or about a national event. Obviously, you can't get to that about Burke County Commission, North Carolina. You know, go to Morganton and cover the Burke County Commission. You've got a few hundred or a few thousand people who are likely to ever read that. That's why I think that at the local level, previously there was a reasonable economy. There was a reasonable business to be built on a large slice of commerce in that community that the newspaper handled in some fashion. That's not going to happen anymore. So we got to figure out a way to pay for news gathering and news production and news distribution for lots of small communities where the potential readership of any one story is not very big. But if no one's covering it, it's going to be a disaster. And then eventually you get the national version of it, which is often first of all, in addition to it being sensationalized or inaccurate, it's also too late, right? You don't want to get to the point where it is so outrageous that somebody's been ripping off the taxpayers for 15 years that it becomes a state or national story. You want somebody to be figuring it out the first year. And you're only going to do that by having somebody who is not just a volunteer, who's not just someone who showed up one night and figured it out, because that's very unlikely, but someone who knows something about the beat, knows something about how government budget documents are written and how to interpret them, who knows who the county manager is, who knows the county manager's been there for 10 years, who knows the county manager's brother-in-law is the district attorney. I mean, that kind of thing. And so I think that the way we're going to have to solve that problem is some combination of philanthropy and enterprises that are look very different than the old newspaper system did, but that generate that essential information for the practice of democracy.
Yeah, I think too, what we were touching on earlier when we were talking about national versus local stories is kind of that practice that I've seen like on social media where, you know, they're at a school board meeting and someone gets up and starts singing about vaccines. And that's the viral clip that everyone's like, oh my God, what's going on in North Carolina? But then, you know, that's pretty much where it ends. It's like, you know, you watch that clip, it's hilarious. Now let's keep scrolling. You know, I think that's not really helpful at all. It's not useful. And, you know, I think we see more of that. I think that is, you know, to everyone's detriment, but more common, it's easy.
Good evening. I have a comment and then an unrelated question. The comment is, I served on the Chapel Hill Town Council from 1991 through 99, and we were covered by 4 newspapers and 1 radio station, and the coverage was superb. The reporters knew what they were doing, they knew the issues, they reported them beautifully, and I would thank the journalism school that trained most of them, the UNC Journalism School, for their work. So thank you. My comment is about the Ukrainian situation and Russia. We have been seeing on our national news very grotesque pictures of what Russian soldiers have done in the Ukraine. Do you have any knowledge about what the Russian people, the man on the street, Russian people are seeing?
There is some coverage of what the coverage looks like in Russia, and it's kind of what you would expect. Now, this isn't really 1984. They can't really prevent people from learning anything about, for example, the atrocities that have been uncovered in the last few days. But what they are being told is that it's been manufactured, it's been staged, it's been done by Ukrainians in order to make the Russian forces look bad. Sometimes some coverage would be something like, well, there could be some misbehavior by certain you know, there were some people who were out of command and control. It was certainly not the official policy of the state. So that's what they hear over and over again. They don't hear any alternative explanation like this is what the occupation looks like. And so I think it demonstrates the extent that a modern state can significantly curtail the range of opinion and analysis that people get about facts, even if they hear about the facts. And of course, they don't always even hear about the facts. Now, we should never attempt to compare the level of control of media in Russia to any of the problems that we've been talking about, because we just don't have that level of problem. But I think it illustrates the extreme effects that could happen if we don't champion through not just how journalists do their job, but also think about how the tech companies and algorithms work to feed us information that reinforces our pre-existing notions, to which we are also culprits because we are subject to selection bias. We're going to tend to grab after stories that reinforce that I was right all along, you know. And so all of us has a role to, we all have a role to play in avoiding that kind of fate. We're not anywhere near that yet, but you can see that it's a potential destination.
So can I just add a quick comment to that? Because I spent a lot of the last couple of years researching and reporting on modern propaganda and disinformation efforts in you know, more authoritarian or illiberal countries, right? And I would recommend a book by a guy named Peter Pomerantsev who studies this stuff. He wrote a memoir of his time as a TV producer in Russia called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And he talked about how the modern approach to propaganda in Russia is actually not wholly reliant on shutting down access to dissenting views. Instead, what the Soviet Union has done and what modern Russians do, the Russian government does, is it floods the zone with competing narratives and contradictions and conspiracy theories to the point where the average person basically throws their hands up and says, I don't know what to believe. I'm just going to go about my day, right? Because it's so difficult in this modern era with the internet the way that it is to actually fully shut down information that an illiberal leader doesn't want people to see. They don't really need to anymore. They can harness social media. They can harness the internet to perform what this guy, Peter Pomerantsev, calls censorship through noise. Basically, rather than trying to shut down the truth, you drown it out with so many lies and distortions and conspiracy theories that people just, you know, they can't pay attention anymore. And I would differ a little with John. Obviously, we can't say that that's happening here, but I don't know how far away from that we are, because again, I don't think we'll ever, you know, fingers crossed, probably not, at least in the next 10 years. I don't think we'll get to the point where, you know, there's mass government censorship of our media or news media. But I do think that we're already reaching a point where American political propagandists are figuring out how to adapt these tools that have been pioneered in places like Russia and use them here. And I think censorship through noise is a real problem that we're going to confront more and more.
Thank you so much for this. Has been very interesting. Earlier, Mr. Coppins, you touched on this notion of a marketplace of ideas and how you used to, I'm not sure if you still do, buy into it. I think it's like rooted in this more like epistemic idea that truth emerges from pitting half truths, if you will, against each other. And this idea that there is such thing as right ideas if you have a democracy and like free flowing information to pin ideas against each other. So in that case, I'm curious to hear from Mrs. Banaski and Mr. Hood on your thoughts about marketplace of ideas and whether you buy into this idea of higher truth, or do you believe in the democratic free-flowing information just for its own sake as a right that is bestowed upon all citizens? In other words, do you believe in higher truth, or is it just about free-flowing information?
Well, I'm a conservative, so the stereotype is true. I'm pro-markets. So I think markets are good. I don't think they're perfect. I think, in fact, it's impossible to have perfect information. It's impossible to have perfect anything in human institutions. So I believe, just myself, but also as a journalist, of course there is a truth. There is the truth. The truth does exist. And we can never, as flawed human beings, fully grasp it. But our job is to chase after it, even though we can't quite ever get there. And so the more we chase after it, the closer we get to something that reflects the actual truth. If there are multiple people in good faith, not engaged in flood the zone, censorship by noise, but are pursuing the truth, and they have different takes on it, and we're all consuming alternative takes. And I think that over time, you tend to drive the worst takes on reality out in favor of the better takes, which in my view is all you can accomplish, but that's pretty good. So I'm in favor of that. To your point about, well, maybe it is just that people have a right to know. They also have a right to know, in my opinion, too. I mean, they have a legal right. I think they have a legal right under our Constitution, state and federal, to certain information that are public records, to witness or have somebody on their behalf witness public meetings. I mean, those are rights, genuinely rights, legal rights. But I think the reason why framers of these constitutions enshrine these rights in law, even if they themselves were hypocrites about it sometimes, it's the way it works because we're human beings. But the reason they did it is because ultimately they had this marketplace of ideas notion that if you have more rather than fewer reporters covering something, if more rather than fewer institutions that are free to publish, free to broadcast, that you are ultimately going to be better off as a democratic society. People are going to be closer, have more of a grasp of the truth than otherwise they would, even though we can all stipulate that it has never worked according to plan exactly, and it will never entirely work according to plan because human beings are flawed. Therefore, all of our institutions have flaws.
So I agree a little bit. So I mean, I do think that there is a place, and I think it's actually, I feel like things have changed to the reason this is kind of hard for me to answer is because I feel like that like 10 years ago, this would have been a different conversation. It just feels to me like part of the marketplace of ideas to me would also require honest and intellectually honest discourse. And like, I don't know that that's there anymore. It feels like that is, you know, I think that when you have a marketplace of ideas and you should be willing to have an open conversation, and you should be able to hear someone disagree with you without like, you know, experiencing a meltdown. Like you should be able to say, well, you know, say more about that. Let's get at that. That felt like early in my career, like that seemed attainable. And that doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels like every time, not every time, because I'm sure that is still happening, perhaps in smaller pockets. But when there's disagreement, it so often flares into something ugly as opposed to something productive. When it has the potential to do both, like it could go either way. And it really involves how you want to approach it, you know, and you have to, I think we even have to challenge ourselves in our media consumption of are we willing to challenge ourselves to read things that kind of make us uncomfortable, like I was saying, and explore why that might be, you know, so.
Perhaps we have time for one more question.
I have a twofold question for you all. Something that we've discussed about is that we exist currently in an environment without shared realities, and that is perpetuating the political polarization we see today. If the solution to this is local journalism, how do we A, ensure the incentives to start local journalism exist, and B, secure the longevity of these organizations? Mr. Hood, you mentioned philanthropic and educational institutions as potential solution. And Mr. Coppins, you also mentioned philanthropic initiatives when you interviewed, I believe, Stuart Bainum to discuss his startup of the Baltimore digital platform. Do you guys have any information on that topic? I'd greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, this question, because I did want to, and we've discussed it a little bit, but I do want to say that there are signs of hope on the horizon for local journalism. I actually just a couple weeks ago spoke at a dinner for the American Journalism Project, which is a nonprofit organization that is basically bringing together philanthropists and donors to try to solve this problem, or at least address it. And it was really fascinating because these are, you know, a lot of pretty wealthy philanthropists who have decided that that solving the crisis of local journalism is actually one of the most important issues that we need to address as a society. And that's saying something. There are a lot of huge problems in our society, but their argument basically is that for us to address any of the big issues that we have in our country, we need local journalism to exist. It's the mechanism by which we will educate people, have debates, hopefully reach consensus, get to the point where we can address big problems in our society. And, Stuart Bainham, I think, would belong in that crowd. He wasn't at this particular dinner, but he's a guy who has lived in Maryland his whole life, very wealthy hotel magnate, saw Alden Global Capital, this hedge fund, buy the Baltimore Sun, and saw the writing on the wall and decided that he was going to start a new nonprofit news organization in Baltimore that was really well funded, much better funded than almost any other kind of nonprofit digital news startup. It's going to launch with a newsroom of 50 people. He hopes to grow that over the coming years. He wants it to immediately be the size, basically, of the Baltimore Sun. And things like that are happening all over the country. I have a certain sentimental attachment to these legacy newspapers that are shrinking and contracting, and in some cases being gutted. But I don't know if they can be saved. I hope that they can. There are some interesting experiments with doing that. In the meantime, I think that a lot of these nonprofit news organizations that are popping up throughout the country are going to be a really important piece of the puzzle to solve that. And I'm heartened to see that there are people paying attention to them. I guess my plug for the people in this room who don't have millions of dollars to throw at a local news organization would be to seek out the local news organizations that serve the communities that you live in or that you care about. And if nothing else, read them, start reading them. And if possible, maybe donate to them. It really is, I'm going to sound overly earnest here, but I do think it's really important to the future of our democracy that these local news organizations, both the legacy ones and the brand new startup ones, are getting support from civic-minded people like the ones who would come on a rainy night to a panel about journalism and democracy.
Neferi and John, can you give us your parting thoughts?
Save local journalism. But yeah, I mean, I of course agree with everything McKay was saying. I local, and I'm one of those people who I would say, I grew up with this sort of romantic attachment to traditional news, and watching movies like, The Paper and things like that, and thinking, but I mean, I think we have to let go of the fact that it's not going to look that way. And it's fine as long as we can create new models that can serve that same function. I've been seeing a lot of the same smaller pop-ups in my region. The problem is, and even with the paper where I ended my career, they kind of laid everyone off and kind of brought in new people, but there is that danger of the fact that there's no institutional knowledge there anymore. So they're kind of trying to learn as they're going along. And my concern is always that, the fact that local leaders are aware of this and they know that they're dealing with amateurs who are probably just kind of trying to, keep their heads afloat. So, I mean, my advice was always in the newsroom to journalists was to read as much as you can, consume as much, media as you can, and just sort of understand your local laws, where you're going to be, wherever you cover. Just I just feel like there's just so much opportunity to be taken advantage of. And, I think that it's really important to, kind of prepare yourself as much as possible, knowing that you may be walking into a newsroom that where you don't have an editor, a dedicated editor, so, but still save local journalism. Absolutely.
Well, I think we're up against the buzzer. But what I will say is, I think there are solutions to this problem. I think we can try them and iterate and solve the problem over time, as long as we don't get too wedded to our preconceived notions about what these solutions are going to look like, what the local media market is going to look like. It's going to look very different than it used to, but it just might work out.
So it sounds like the moral of this evening is that civilization is eroding, but maybe not collapsing, right? All right.